Have you ever looked at your sewing machine and realized there's a hecking ton of sewing stitches in it? But really, what are the essential sewing stitches that every beginner must know? That's today's topic in Sewing Saturday. As a sewing beginner, we sometimes get confused with so many tips and tutorials online. And I'm glad to introduce you to our newest sewing video series featuring the easiest tips and tricks that I wish I learned when I started sewing. It's Julius again from Sew It's Your Style, and welcome to Sewing Saturday, where we teach you how to become a better sewer. From tips and tricks, all the way to making your very first project. Join us today as we explore the basics of sewing. Welcome once again, and thank you for joining us in another episode of Sewing Saturday. It's Julius here, your socialist neighbor, and as mentioned, today is all about the commonly used and essential sewing machine stitches that every beginner must know. Generally speaking, most sewing machines today comes with a great range of functionality, and Brother Sewing Machines is no exception to that, as they offer a plethora of features that can be used depending on the type of project you're working with. Moreover, the foundation of every impeccable garment solely relies on the different stitching techniques that your sewing machine has to offer. And even the simplest sewing machines today should be able to accommodate those commonly used machine stitches. Our featured sewing machine today, the Brother NV180, the sewing and embroidery computerized sewing machine, boasts a total of 181 stitches. Now that's quite a lot, but there is a reason for it having this too many stitches. Simply because Brother wants you to have the convenience of having all the necessary stitches to be able to create an actual garment and more, your other projects such as your quilts, your bags, your home decor projects, etc., and so on. But if I say so myself, it's not that many. It's just enough. No, who am I kidding? 181 stitches is quite a lot. And I'm pretty sure that most of you are adept at simply just using your straight stitch, your zigzag stitch, your buttonhole stitch. So let's break it down. There are actually two categories of stitches, main categories. The first one is the utility stitches, and the second one is the decorative stitches. However, today we will be focusing solely on the utility stitches, as I will have a separate video only intended for using decorative stitches, so watch out for that. It's gonna be on the upcoming episodes of Sewing Saturday. As beginners, it is important to know these utility stitches, as they can be very helpful in the context of constructing your garments or your other projects. So, utility stitches are utilitarian in nature, which means they're mostly used for reinforcement, joining two pieces of fabric together, and most of all, they're used in the actual construction of the garment. So the first utility stitch that most of us is familiar with is the straight stitch. The straight stitch is a lock stitch, which involves two sets of thread, namely the needle thread and the bobbin thread. The mechanism is achieved when the bobbin thread entwines with the upper thread, forming a lock. The straight stitch is used mostly for general sewing, gathering, pin tucks, basting, piecing, quilting, and so on. It is highly versatile. And as I have mentioned, the length of the stitch is determined by the thickness of the material being worked on. A longer stitch length is suitable for medium to heavyweight fabrics, whereas a shorter stitch length is suitable for lightweight to sheer fabrics. So adjust the stitch length on your sewing machine based on the material you're working with. So these are obviously straight stitches in varying lengths, This is the shortest at 0.5 millimeters. This is at 2.0 millimeters. This is at 2.5, which is by default. This is at 3. This is at 4, and the longest is at 5. The longest is often used for basting or temporary stitches, as this stitch can be easily unpicked. So all of these are used in general sewing purposes. Now, if we go back to the earlier versions of sewing machines, probably in the 19th or early 20th century, most sewing machines back then doesn't have a back stitch function. Securing a stitch or a straight stitch on those machines were basically done by leaving a long tail of thread to be knotted at the end of the stitch. However, modern sewing machines today has a back stitch function, presumably available on all sewing machines, and securing a stitch is simply done by pressing this backstitch button on your sewing machine. This is a must when sewing a straight stitch, except for instances wherein a temporary stitch or a basting stitch is needed. One thing to point out is that a straight stitch or a regular straight stitch cannot be used for sewing stretch fabrics, simply because the stitches will break when the fabric is obviously stretched. The Brother NV180 has a specific straight stitch specifically designed for fabrics that has a lot of give or stretch. It is the stretch stitch. This machine has a triple stretch stitch, ideal for sewing knits, jerseys, or fabrics with spandex or similar content. Now, the stretch stitched should be used in conjunction with a stretch needle. And I have mentioned this previously in my first episode of Sewing Saturday, wherein I talked all about the different types of needles. The next commonly used stitch is the zigzag stitch. Goodness, I cannot remember how many times I have uttered the word stitch in this video, and still counting. So the zigzag stitch is a variant geometry of the lock stitch, wherein a straight stitch will not suffice. It is commonly used for applique, bar tacks, satin stitching, elastic sewing, mending, as well as seam finishing. And not many sewing beginners know that you can use the zigzag stitch for enclosing raw edges of the fabric. Similar to the straight stitch, the zigzag stitch can be adjusted not just by its length, but also by its width, depending on what is being achieved, of course. So these are the zigzag stitches in varying lengths and widths. This is the smallest, usually for bar tacks or reinforcement. Notice how they were spaced so closely together and with a smaller stitch length. Now, this one here is used for applique and mending. Notice the length of the stitches and the width, or the spaces between the stitches. They are tightly spaced together, as this is to ensure that the applique doesn't come off eventually. So this one is very similar to the bar tack stitching. The only difference is the length of the stitch that is used. So this one right here is a wide, long zigzag. And this one is for seam finishing, which is the longest and the widest setting. And these two right here are for elastic sewing. This one here is the 2 steps elastic, which is used for medium and stretch fabrics, and this is done by sewing 2 diagonal stitches before the needle changes direction to create an elongated zigzag stitch. And this right here is the 3 steps elastic, suitable for heavyweight and stretch fabrics. This is done by sewing 3 diagonal stitches before changing direction, hence the term 3 steps elastic. and both are used for elastic sewing. So it's really good to explore and make use of these zigzag stitches, as it will definitely show improvement on your sewing projects. The next one is one of my favorites, the overcast stitch. As I have repeatedly mentioned in my previous sewing videos, the overcast stitch is mainly used for enclosing or finishing the raw edges of the fabric to prevent fraying or unraveling. There are various overcasting stitch on the Brother NV180, all with their intended purpose, of course, based on the fabric being worked on. In addition, the overcast stitch can be used for decorative purposes on your garments or on your home decor projects. So these are the overcast stitches that the Brother NV180 have. One thing to point out when using the overcast stitch is the type of stitch being used. And of course, the overcast stitch must be used in conjunction with the presser foot, which is the overcast foot. You will notice that these stitches are either going in a continuous forward stitching, while the others have a back and forth movement when being sewn. And this is because the continuous forward overcasting stitch is designed for non-stretchy fabrics, while the ones with a back and forth movement is for stretchy fabrics. So it's really great to keep that in mind to achieve a better looking finish on your garments. So all these stitches were done on a non-stretchy fabric so that I can show you their differences. The first one right here is ideal for reinforcing light to medium weight fabrics. The stitching is a combination of a single straight stitch and a zigzag stitch, repeated multiple times in continuous forward stitching. And as I have mentioned, this overcast stitch is great for reinforcing lightweight, non-stretchy fabrics. Now the two overcasting stitches below looks more like they're done on an overlocker. The first one is ideal for heavyweight fabrics such as canvas, wool or denim, or fabrics that does not easily fray. While the one below is for fabrics that are friable, or fabrics that easily frays or unravel. And this stitch is ideal for medium to heavyweight fabrics such as your suiting and shirting fabrics. Now these two right here are for your stretch fabrics, or for your jerseys, or for your knits. You will notice that they look very similar, and they can be used either way. Both are ideal for stretch knits, but this one right here adds a decorative touch to the edges. So both are used for stretch fabrics. So friends, these are the commonly used essential sewing machine stitches that every beginner must know as early as possible in their sewing journey, as learning all this can really strengthen the foundation of your knowledge when it comes to the construction aspect of the garment making process. And it adds value to your work as a sewer. And remember, the hallmark of a well-made garment is determined by looking at the different stitching techniques that went into it during the construction process. And I hope that you remember this tiny bit of information that I shared with you today. And I hope that it's helpful. And we will explore more in the coming episodes of Sewing Saturday. So, it's Julius here once again, and I will see you anon.